Part 3. People on the Move. Americans were people on the move. There would have been nobody in America except the Indians unless millions of people from the Old World had been willing to cross the ocean. The United States might have been only a string of seaboard farms and cities if brave new Americans had not been willing to risk the move further west. Going into the half-mapped continent meant, of course, traveling into the unknown, but Americans were willing, even eager, to risk new places. The Civil War, too, meant the moving of peoples. Thousands of men fought great battles in armies that moved all over the countryside. The fortunes of war brought Virginians to Gettysburg in Pennsylvania and sent Massachusetts volunteers deep into Georgia. Even while the armies of General William T. Sherman cut their bloody swath through the South, the Union men could not help seeing the beauties of the Southern land. They discovered that Southerners were not so different from themselves. Thousands of Americans pried into far corners of their country. After the war, many soldiers returned to their old homes. A few stayed where they had fought and found wives and homes in the new places. Some Northerners went south to teach school or help in the Freedmen's Bureau. From the burnt-over South, hopeful Southerners went north or west in search of opportunity. Black men and women, at last free to leave the old plantation, for the first time were able to move about like other Americans. Go ahead became an American motto. Of course, go-getting Americans were eager to move up in the world, but they were just as eager to move around. The same spirit that before the Civil War had led Americans to move westward in wagon towns, that had led them to build railroads even before there were cities to go to, now led Americans to move and to keep moving. After the Civil War, brave and needy men and women from around the world were still willing to risk the ocean to come to America, fill the land, and crowd the cities. Many had come from impoverished European farms because they had heard extravagant promises, and thousands of already in America were disappointed by the American land. They moved hopefully to the cities. The Americans kept telling themselves, "Go ahead, move on, try to find a better place." As Americans churned about the vast continent, they came to know their land and to know one another. Most nations of the Old World were rooted to the same spot. Their people were held together because their ancestors had lived so long inside the same boundaries, it was unusual for them to move. They learned to be satisfied with their place. But Americans would not let themselves be confined anywhere for long. Americans were held together by their ways of moving and by their shared desire to move. And the freedom to move to a better place helped build the nation. Chapter 12. To Punish or to Forgive. Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox brought peace to the nation, but peace brought new problems. How could the million men who left the Union and Confederate armies find jobs? How could factory owners change their factories from making cannons, rifles, and ammunition to making harvesters and sewing machines? When the South agreed to unconditional surrender, they put themselves at the mercy of the North. This gave Northerners their most difficult problem: what to do with the South. Was it more important to punish the former rebels, to teach them a lesson they would never forget, so they never again would try to break up the Union? Or was it better to forgive the rebels, to welcome them back into the Union, so they would feel at home and never again want to leave? Of course, the South had already been punished. 250,000 Southerners had died in the war. The Confederacy was a land of cinders and desolation, of charred plantation houses, broken bridges, twisted railways, and desecrated churches. An Englishman who traveled halfway across the South said he did not see a single smiling face. But the North had also suffered, with its 250,000 dead, and for Northerners who had lost fathers, sons, or husbands, no punishment of the South seemed enough. Yet this was not just a question of feelings. Unless the North wanted to feed and house millions of Southerners, it was important to get the South back into working order. This meant getting crops planted, factories built, railroads running, and pupils and teachers into schools. It also meant getting the Southern states organized to govern themselves, to collect their own taxes, to keep the peace, and to protect life and property. But it was not easy to get people to agree on how to revive the Southern states. There was wide disagreement on what the war had really meant, what the North called the War of the Rebellion, the South called the War between the states. The Southerners argued that their state governments had never been destroyed. Once a state, always a state. Lincoln himself had almost agreed with the Southerners on this point. He also believed once a state, always a state, but for Lincoln, this meant that the Southern states had no power to secede. And if the Southern states had never really seceded, then after the Civil War, the Southern states were still within the United States. Naturally, once the war was over, Southerners wanted to agree with Lincoln. They said they still had their states and therefore could still run their own affairs. The most, then, that the victorious North could properly ask was that some Confederate leaders be barred from office. But on the other side were the Northern Avengers. The most powerful of them were in a group of Northern senators and congressmen called Radical Republicans. They were bitter against the Southern rebels. They remained suspicious of all white Southerners. They did not want to forgive and forget, but instead wanted to rub salt in Southern wounds. The Southern states said the Radical Republicans had actually committed suicide. By trying to rebel, they had not only violated the Constitution, but actually destroyed their own states. They were no longer states at all. People who thought like this believed that after the war, the Southern states could claim no rights under the Constitution. They had no right to govern themselves or to be represented in the Senate or the House of Representatives. They were nothing but so much territory, like parts of the sparsely settled West, and like those Western territories, Congress could govern them any way they wanted. Congress could treat them as conquered provinces. They could rule them by military governors, generals of the Union Army. When, if ever, Congress would allow them to govern themselves and take part in the national government, this would depend on how they behaved themselves and what the victorious Congress wanted. This offered anything but a cheerful prospect for the Southerners. The leader of the Radical Republicans was one of the strangest men in American history. Thaddeus Stevens was sometimes called a humanitarian without humanity. He seemed to use up all his good feelings on large noble causes, but then he had very little left for individuals. Stevens was a sour man. Just as Lincoln inspired love and respect, Stevens inspired fear. Very early in life, Stevens took up the great cause of abolishing slavery. He never gave it up, nor did he ever forgive men who had ever held slaves or who had been entangled in the web of slavery. After Appomattox, Stevens made it his purpose in life to punish all traitors. Old age never mellowed him. At the age of 75, he boasted that he would spend his remaining years inventing new ways to make the Southern rebels suffer. During the Civil War, Lincoln had shown his greatness and his forgiving spirit. By his plan to bring Southerners back to the Union, he was less interested in the past than in the future. Back on December 8, 1863, in his proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, he had explained his plan. He would pardon almost all Southerners, even if they had fought against the Union. All Lincoln asked was that the Southerners take a solemn oath to support the Constitution of the United States in the future. As soon as enough citizens of a Southern state took the oath, Lincoln would recognize the government of that state and let the people govern themselves, if of course they must agree to abolish slavery. Lincoln said it would be enough if a number equal to only 1/10 of the voters in the last election took the oath. This plan did not satisfy the Radical Republicans. They were busy in Congress making a plan of their own. During the war, they concocted their Wade-Davis bill in quite another spirit. They could not take their eyes off the past. Under their plan, each Southern state had to make a list of all its white men. The state could not be recognized or given the power to govern itself until a majority of the people on the list took a new oath to support the Constitution. Then, said the Radicals, since they believed that the old Southern states had committed suicide, there would have to be an election to call a convention to make an entirely new Constitution for each Southern state. No one could even vote in that election, much less be a delegate to help make the new Constitution, unless he took the ironclad oath. This oath was not merely a promise of future loyalty, but was also an oath of past purity. You had to swear that you had never held office under the Confederacy or fought in the Confederate Army. By the end of the war, most white men in the South could not honestly take such an oath. Under the Radical scheme, it would be years before any Southern state could set up a majority government for itself. It would have to wait until the whole Civil War generation was dead. But that did not bother the Radical Republicans. They were quite willing to keep the Southern states under military rule by Northern generals. They said they were in favor of liberty, but they were not willing to give it to white Southerners. This was the Wade-Davis bill, and it passed Congress on July 2, 1864. It could not be law unless Lincoln signed it. What would Lincoln do? Lincoln refused to sign the bill, but he was shrewd. Instead of attacking it for being evil and vengeful, as he might have, or instead of saying simply that the plan for the South was the business of the President and not of Congress, he issued a new proclamation. He would not sign the Wade-Davis bill into law because he believed there should be other ways a Southern state could get back into working order. Any seceded Southern state that wanted to follow the Wade-Davis plan should feel free to do so, but there were now two possible paths. Any Southern state could choose between Lincoln's 1/10 plan and the Radicals' majority ironclad oath plan. In the long run, of course, no Southern state would prefer the vengeful Radical plan, but still Lincoln had done his best to avoid a head-on clash with Congress. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln called his cabinet together to explain his policy to them. He urged them to use charity. He begged them to help end the wartime spirit. That very night, when President Lincoln and his wife went to Ford's Theater in Washington to attend a play, there occurred one of the great disasters of the Civil War era and of all American history. It was less than a week after Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. An unstable, unsuccessful actor named John Wilkes Booth, who was an ardent Southern supporter, snuck quietly into Lincoln's box seat and shot the unguarded president in the back of the head. President Lincoln died the next day. We cannot be sure what would have happened if Lincoln had lived, but we do know that Lincoln's combination of qualities was extremely rare. He was, of course, a strong man who would fight for what he believed, yet he was also a simple, gentle man who understood other people. And most important for a president, he was a clever politician. He knew how to give up less important things in order to persuade people to support him on what was more important. Andrew Johnson was the new president was in many ways like Lincoln. With no schooling, he began as a poor tailor. He too was a self-made man. Like Lincoln, he had been born in the South, and though he came from Tennessee, he had been against secession. When he was the Democratic senator from Tennessee, he was the only Southern senator to support the Union after the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. Still, in some important ways, Johnson was no Lincoln. He was not good at persuading. He did not know how to use a joke to make a serious point. Just as Lincoln was gentle, generous, and compromising, so Johnson was crude and obstinate. His weaknesses would not have been serious in an ordinary citizen, but they were disastrous in a president. Congress was not in session when Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865. Many Republicans distrusted Johnson because he had been a Democrat. They had added him to the Republican ticket as their candidate for vice president in 1864 in the hope that he might draw the seceded states back into the Union. Now, when the death of Lincoln had brought Johnson to the White House, the radical Republicans wanted President Johnson to call Congress into special session to make new rules for the South, but he refused. President Johnson would follow the rules already declared by Lincoln, and he alone would decide when the Southern states had satisfied Lincoln's requirements so they could govern themselves. Lincoln's requirements were not too hard for the Southern states to satisfy. By December 1865, when President Johnson made his first report to Congress, all but one of the old Confederate states had done what Lincoln had asked for. The lone exception, Texas, soon came along. Each of these now had its own government in working order. President Johnson reported happily that the Union was restored. But when the congressmen from these southern states came to take their seats in Congress, the radical Republicans shut them out. The radicals controlled the House of Representatives and told them that they were not really congressmen at all because the southern states were not really states at all. Even if the Confederate states had followed the president's rules, the radicals said the president had no power to make the rules. Only Congress, by which they meant, of course, the radical Republicans themselves, had the power. Their punishing bill, the Wade-Davis bill, had declared what Congress wanted. The South would have to be restored by Congress or not at all. Congress set up its own committee on Reconstruction to make its own plan. Radical Avenger Thaddeus Stevens led the committee. The watchword of Stevens' congressional plan, force. The South, he said, was a conquered province, and nobody would be allowed to forget it. Northern troops would be sent to occupy the South. The committee divided the old Confederacy into 5 military districts. The boundaries of the 11 seceded states were not to be respected. Each of the 5 districts would be ruled by a Northern general. The Northern radical Republicans in Congress laid down new rules for building new Southern states. They wished to see the new states designed to keep political control in Republican hands. Some of the radical demands, such as abolishing slavery and giving civil rights to blacks, were just and necessary, but others were not. First of all, was the radicals' refusal to forgive. They denied many leading citizens in the Old South a right to vote, or even to work at their regular jobs. Hungry for power, the radicals wanted to rule the South through a small group of their puppets, and they were anxious to hold their Republican majority in Congress. They were afraid the new Southern congressmen might be against them. Although the radicals said they loved liberty, they really were afraid of it. They were afraid to give political liberty to their old enemies. So what was President Johnson to do? Under the Constitution, he was supposed to enforce the laws of Congress. Though he believed some of their laws were unwise, he tried to enforce them. But the radicals were out to get Johnson. They could not bear the idea that they might not be able to control the president. So they passed the laws that took away the powers of the Constitution had given to the president. For example, the Constitution made the president the commander-in-chief of the army, but the radicals passed a Command of the Army Act that took away his power to command. They were obviously spoiling for a fight. They were hoping to tease the president into violating some law that would give them an excuse to have him removed from office. They hoped that then they could seize the powers of the president. But Johnson was careful to obey every law, to follow all the instructions of Congress. Still, there was a limit to his patience. When the radicals passed the Tenure of Office Act, which took away the president's control over his own cabinet, Johnson decided they had gone too far. Johnson had inherited Secretary of War Stanton from Lincoln, but Stanton had become Johnson's enemy and was actually plotting against him, so the president fired Stanton. The Tenure of Office Act said Johnson didn't have authority to do such a thing. Johnson, meanwhile, believed such a limitation was against the Constitution. In the total scope of things, Stanton's firing was small, but it was big enough to give the radicals an opportunity, and they took it. The framers of the Constitution, being wise men, had provided a way to remove a criminal president, but they saw that if they made it too easy to remove a president, opponents would be tempted to use it to get rid of any president they could not beat at the polls. Then every president would live in terror, afraid to do his duty for some fear that some political enemy would make a crime out of it. The Constitution, Article 2, Section 4, says that Congress can remove a president only on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. First, the House of Representatives has to impeach the president. This means a majority vote to support a list of accusations. Then the Senate has to try the president. The Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court presides, but the entire Senate must vote. To remove a president, a mere majority of the Senate is not enough. The framers showed their special wisdom when they required a vote of 2/3 of the members present. When the Senate met on March 30th, 1868, to try President Andrew Jackson on the impeachment brought by the House of Representatives, the nation was in breathless suspense. Few really believed that Andrew Johnson had been guilty of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Johnson was a man of rock-ribbed honesty. No one could prove otherwise. Earnestly, he had followed his inaugural oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Perhaps he had sometimes lost his temper, had shown bad judgment, or had used language that a president should not use, but these were not crimes. His only crime had been that he believed it his duty to obey the Constitution, and he was determined to follow a policy of forgiveness. He could not have satisfied the radicals without surrendering all the powers of the presidency into their hands. On May 16, 1868, when the Senate finally voted, 35 senators voted guilty, 19 voted not guilty. Those voting guilty were in a large majority, but they had one vote less than the 2/3 required by the Constitution. Andrew Johnson remained president.